Ecosystems. Ecosystems. An ecosystem is all the living things that live in the same place, as well as the physical environment they live in and the relationships between them. An ecosystem has two components: living things, the physical environment. Living things: animals, plants, algae, fungi, and bacteria. Together, these form the biosphere. Fauna is all the animals in an ecosystem. Flora is all of its plants. Living things are grouped into species. Members of the same species look similar and can reproduce together. Physical environments. All of the non-living components of an ecosystem, including the factors that affect living things. In terrestrial environments, temperature, humidity, soil, and relief. In aquatic environments, saltwater, light, currents, temperature, and the seabed. Physical environment continued. Living things adapt to their environment to survive. Example: animals that live in the desert have adapted by being able to live in high temperatures and without much water. Many living things change their environment and adapt it to their needs. Example: moles dig holes in tunnels. This adds air to the earth. Questions: how has the giraffe adapted to its environment? How has the snake adapted to its environment? Questions: how has the giraffe adapted to its environment? The giraffe has adapted to its environment by using its long neck to feed in treetops. How has the snake adapted to its environment? The snake has adapted to its environment by camouflaging. Photosynthesis. Plants make their own food using sunlight, carbon dioxide, water, and mineral salts. Plants release oxygen during photosynthesis. Photosynthesis. 1. Water and mineral salts. Plants absorb water and mineral salts from the soil through their roots. Mixture of water and mineral salts is called raw sap. 2. The raw sap. Raw sap travels up the stem to the leaves through tubes called xylem vessels. 3. Photosynthesis. Raw sap transforms into elaborated sap, a mixture of water and food. Carbon dioxide and sunlight are needed. 4. Nutrients. Nutrients in the elaborated sap travel to the rest of the plant through tubes called phloem vessels. What happens during each step of photosynthesis? Step 1. Water and plants absorb and from the soil. The mixture of water and mineral salts is called Step 2. The raw sap travels up through tubes called xylem vessels. Step 3. Raw sap transforms into a mixture of water and food. This process needs and Step 4. The nutrients in the travel to the rest of the plant through tubes called. What happens during each step of photosynthesis? Step 1. Water and mineral salts. Plants absorb water and mineral salts from the soil. The mixture of water and mineral salts is called raw sap. Step 2. The raw sap. The raw sap travels up the stem to the leaves through tubes called xylem vessels. Step 3. Photosynthesis. Raw sap transforms into elaborated sap, a mixture of water and food. This process needs carbon dioxide and sunlight. Step 4. Nutrients. The nutrients in the elaborated sap travel to the rest of the plant through tubes called phloem vessels. Food relationships. All living things need food to survive. Producers. Living things that make their own food. They provide food for other living things. For example, plants and algae. Consumers. Living things that obtain their food from other living things. They cannot make their own food. Primary consumers are herbivores. They eat plants. Secondary consumers are carnivores. They eat other animals. Tertiary consumers. They eat secondary consumers. Match. Primary consumers, tertiary consumers, secondary consumers, producers, consumers. Are herbivores, they eat plants. Are carnivores, they feed on other animals. Are living things that make their own food, they provide for other living things. They feed on secondary consumers. Are living things that obtain their food from other living things. Match. Primary consumers are herbivores, they eat plants. Tertiary consumers, they feed on secondary consumers. Secondary consumers are carnivores, they feed on other animals. Producers are living things that make their own food. They provide for other living things. Consumers are living things that obtain their food from other living things. Food chain. Food chains show how living things feed on other living things. The arrows in a food chain always point from the food to the consumer. Label the food chain. Tertiary consumers, producer, primary consumer, secondary consumer. Label the food chain. Grass is a producer. Grasshopper is a primary consumer. Snake is a secondary consumer. An eagle is a tertiary consumer. Food web. Food webs consist of many food chains. It's a more detailed way to show how living things feed on other living things in an ecosystem. A species can belong to different food chains in the same ecosystem. What feeding relationships are shown in this food web? The hawk is A, and it eats. The ladybird is A, it eats, it's eaten by. The snail is A, it eats, it's eaten by. What feeding relationships are shown in this food web? The hawk is a tertiary consumer. It eats blackbird and thrush. The ladybird is a secondary consumer. It eats aphids. It's eaten by blackbirds. The snail is a primary consumer. It eats oak trees. It's eaten by thrush. Other relationships. mutualism, competition, commensalism, parasitism. Mutualism, the relationship between two species where they both benefit from the relationship. For example, bees obtain nectar from flowers, and the flowers are pollinated by the bees. Competition, the relationship between different species that have the same needs. For example, cheetahs and lions. They compete for the same prey. Commensalism, the relationship between two species when one eats the food left by the other. For example, sharks and remoras. Remoras benefit from the sharks. Parasitism, the relationship between two species when one benefits and the other suffers. For example, fleas are parasites to dogs. What are these types of relationships? What are these types of relationships? Mutualism, competition, commensalism, parasitism. Questions. 1. Do animals benefit from mutualism? 2. Are parasites good for living things? 3. What is something a species may compete for? Questions. Do animals benefit from mutualism? Yes, they do. Are parasites good for living things? No, they aren't. What is something a species may compete for? A species may compete for food, water, or shelter.